This is obviously a rags to riches story. This is somebody who has been through the crucible of deception, disappointment, and yet and still you can see God now beginning to turn it around. If you were to look at verse 1 of chapter 41, you'll see that the text says 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. So you shouldn't think that this has happened quickly. The process of his incarceration, the process of the deception of his brothers by his brothers, the false accusation of Mrs. Potiphar, this has been a long stretch for this man Joseph. It's not as if he prayed and asked God to deliver on Friday and on Monday his problems were solved. This is more than a semester. This is more than a 30-day period. For at least 2 years, he's been laboring in a place where he has been put, having done nothing more than try to live right. And 2 years later, God begins the process of moving him from rags to riches, from the prison to the palace. And I think there's a word there for you and I who want God to always work quickly. I submit to you that for Joseph, the process is just about over. That now will enable Joseph to handle whatever promotion is going to bring to him. But there's a funny thing about God. God always prepares you for what he calls you to do. And the tension for you and I is that we don't like the process. We have a Instagram, microwave, quick way of looking at our world and our lives, and we think God should work much quicker than that. But you see, when God is preparing to use you in an environment, God has to first prepare you for his call. And so God is now going to promote Joseph. But if Joseph hadn't gone through what he had gone through, he would not be able to handle the promotion. Because when you put somebody in a position prematurely and they have not been prepared for it, you do them a disservice. And so what God is doing, what God has been up to, is preparing Joseph for the position he will occupy. And now he's about to be promoted, but it's only because he's gone through the process. And I submit to you that when God is moving you through the process, that is not the time to complain. That is not the time to blame. That's the time to be quiet, and rather than say, God, what are you doing to me? That's the time to say, God, what are you making of me? Because in too many instances, we raise our fists at God, angry because of what has occurred. And no one will disparage the human response to difficulty. But I promise you, whenever your life is moving through some dark impasse, the question to raise is, God, what are you trying to make of me? Because at the end of the day, God could fix your problem, but he doesn't. And he doesn't fix it not because he can't. It's because what he wants you to become in the process is more important than the thing you are asking him to do. And so he's fixing Joseph and making Joseph and positioning Joseph to be promoted. In the midst of that idea, there's this call of the king, and the king calls for Joseph. 2 years later, because a free man remembers his sin. Inside the text, it says, finally, in verse 9, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today I have been reminded of my failure, he told Pharaoh. Some time ago you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night the chief baker and I had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant. And everything happened just as he predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. He recalls that there is this Hebrew, this slave. This is not pejorative. This is not a slur. In this case, he is remembering something about the interaction he had with a kidnapped, abducted man who had no business being in prison, who impacted his life in such a powerful way, he could not forget it. He remembered his own failure, but he also remembered a fellow that he met who impacted his life in such a way when the king had an issue, he remembered the strength of Joseph and brought him to the conversation, and the king heard it. Let me offer this caveat. I was talking to a young fella a while back who wanted to remind me and impress me of his black history knowledge, so he wanted me to be clear that they brought slaves out of Africa. And then I decided I wanted to impress him and remind him that what you do with language is important. So be careful how you use it. Because what they did not do was bring slaves out of Africa. They brought kings and queens and metallurgists and scientists and mathematicians and artisans. That's what they brought out of Africa and made them slaves. But if you think you are a slave, you got a problem. Because what came out of Africa were not slaves. These were the manifestations of intellect, the likes of which we had never known. Theology had been developed in Africa, which is why Christianity is more African than it is American. And if all you see is yourself, in the words of Bishop Drake, we started from the bottom. That's not where we started. We didn't start from the bottom, we started at the top. And the goal is to get back to where and who we are as a collective. This man, Joseph, has strengths. And I offer this caveat because I realize that sometimes you might not understand this. Joseph is in Egypt. And Egypt is in Africa. When the king dreams of these emaciated cows and these withering corn stalks, the problem with the king and the reason why the other magicians can't interpret the dream. In fact, in chapter 24 it says, and the shriveled up heads swallowed the 7 healthy heads. I told these dreams to the magicians, but no one could tell me what they mean. In the dream that Pharaoh had, 7 scrawny, emaciated cows ate 7 fat cows. That's not a dream, that's a nightmare. Because cows are not carnivorous. Cows eat grass. They don't eat flesh. And when the king dreams of cows eating other cows and withering corn stalks, what traumatizes the king, what makes this a nightmare, is that in Egyptian Nile Valley civilizations, they never experienced famine. You had the Nile River, which was the birthplace of the Fertile Crescent, of all that was rich in terms of food sources and plant life and animal life. They had never thought of experiencing something like a famine in that area of the world. So when the king dreams and hears of the potential of 7 lean years, that's not a dream, that's a nightmare. And what you have inside this text is an understanding of what ancient Nile Valley civilizations were like. You say, well, why were Africans brought here as slaves? For a host of reasons. But let me tell you, agriculturally, they were able to do what was unable to be done, particularly in the southern states. Growing in the ancient Nile Valley, yams, the size of watermelons. I've seen them. And the kind of ability in terms of agriculture that was existent in this day and in this text made a word about famine shocking. Nobody could understand that. And yet God had a plan because he was raising up somebody named Joseph to go into this. And the text says that when the king calls, it's because there's an inmate who remembers the strength of a fellow prisoner and suggests that he brings him out to interpret his nightmare, i.e. his dream. Look at the text. It says that when the call came in verse 14, he sent for Joseph at once. And the Bible says that Joseph did something that no Jew would do. He shaved. Hebrews didn't shave. Egyptians were clean. Hebrews wore beards. And when Joseph is called to meet the king, he wants to make himself presentable in the presence of the king. I realize there are people who will mock me for this, but you know, I think sometimes what you wear says what you feel about the occasion. I think that sometimes you go to a place looking a certain way because of how you feel about the place and the company you keep. You see, if you invite me to meet Michelle and Barack, I promise you, I'm gonna dress up. And somebody will say, well, you know, clothes don't make the man. I ain't that stupid, I know that. But I'm going to meet somebody I respect. And I wanna make a good impression when I arrive. Which is why when you go for a job interview, you just don't go any kind of way. You clean up because the environment says something about how you feel about it and the people you're about to engage. I realize that's not popular, and I'm not trying to make it seem as if you can be dressed up and still be dirty on the inside, because you can be. You can be a whitewashed sepulcher filled with dead man bones. But when that has changed, something on the outside ought to remind you to stand straight and to look right. I did go see the movie Black Panther, and some of the commentary as I was having it with my children, they were reminding me that my cinematic evaluation card is about to be revoked. It's being revoked because I said things that I realized may be generationally hard to understand. And I had a great time watching the movie. I thought it was a good movie. But some people said to me that when they left the movie, they were walking a little straighter. They were standing a little taller. And I said, no, I went in that way. I've got a grasp on where I come from. And so I didn't go in bent over and then come out straight. I went in straight. I came out straight. And I said, now I hope more of this gets circulated, because we need more to just stand straight and not be proud just of their ethnicity. You need to be that if you are Irish American, if you are Italian American, if you are Jewish American, and if you are African American. Everybody in the country is a hyphenated somebody. But to be proud of who you are is to simply say, God, I'm glad that you made me who I am. And to admire the genius and the design of God that doesn't end even in glory. John said, I looked and I saw every tribe, every nation, every tongue. Because you don't lose your distinctive in the next world. I don't have time to try to explain it. But since it's a part of his creator's genius, and he decided to make you who you are, you ought to stand up straight no matter where you find yourself. He gives the interpretation of the dream, but then in typical Joseph-like fashion, he, at least in my view, steps further than he should. Because he interprets the dream in 31, the famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having two similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will soon make them happen. And then in verse 33, he says, therefore Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint a fifth of all the crops during the 7 good years, have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so that there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to an end, come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. Verse 37, Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. Now, it's strange because Pharaoh didn't ask for advice. He asked for an interpretation. And Joseph, in typical Joseph-like fashion, decided, I'm going to tell everything I know. I think maybe Joseph said, you know what? Your dream is connected to my dream. You see, the Lord told me one time what was going to happen with me. And now that I'm listening to you, this becomes a great opportunity for me to tell you what you need to do. I bet you when Joseph was talking, he was kind of pointing to himself like, you need somebody. You say, Williams, you stepped over the line. I know, but I do have an imagination. And I can sense Joseph feeling something. Now, what I'd like you to see is that the king called Joseph. Joseph didn't call the king. But Joseph knows who the King of Kings is. And he's massaging the memory of the former inmate. And he's working on the mind of the King Pharaoh. And when Joseph gives the interpretation of the dream, he doesn't just stop there. And this is the caveat that I want you to understand. Joseph says to him, here's what you ought to do in verse 34. You should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops. So here's what Joseph does. He offers an economic tax plan. Now I know what you're thinking. That's just him. No. He says to him, you should collect 1/5 of all the crops. And a wise and intelligent leader understands this counsel that is not spiritual, it's economic, with a view toward the common good, not just the elitist. Joseph is a man of God now engaging another sphere in order to produce what is best, not for some of the Egyptians, but for all of the Egyptians. And he's Hebrew. He offers a kind of social security program. He's trying to build it, not destroy it. At some point, somebody gonna catch where I'm headed. He's trying to develop a social security program that as the people put into it, it's gonna help everybody survive and be better, as opposed to dismantling it so that only a few at the top can do better. And so what he's advocating here is an economic program that's developed that will bless everybody by taking a fifth of the crops, storing it so that when the famine hits, everybody can pull from it and be better. It's sad that we live in an economy in a country where we don't have a wise, intelligent leader. Because wise, intelligent leaders are able to do and shape policy that's best for the people, because the common good of the people is the concern of the wise, intelligent leader. But when the leader is only concerned for himself and those like himself, then the banks get bailed out, you get foreclosed. Let me talk the way I want to talk for a minute. I realize that sometimes people can make bad financial decisions. The problem is that when poor people make bad financial decisions, they lose their houses. When banks make bad and corrupt financial decisions, they get bailed out. Now, why does the bank get bailed out and the people get the bum rush? And where is Joseph? We need modern day Josephs who will get in and seek to repair and make sure that what's good for everybody, not just some of us, becomes the order of the day. God has raised Joseph up, placed him in this arena. And every now and then I think of this. Why is it that corporations get welfare and poor people, somebody said, well, you know, the system is abused. Yeah, and your point is what? Not everybody's an abuser. But if you fall on hard times, you need some help. And you look to me, the church, to do what you should do. We ask people to give 10%. You take 35 and ask me to do more with less than you're willing to do. God raises him up, inserts him in this environment, and God then promotes him. From the prison, he's now in the palace. And here's what the king says in verse 41. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand, placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. And then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, kneel down. So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval. That's rags to riches. That's somebody that can come up. Have you noticed how in this text is always about clothes? We are a long way from the coat of many colors now. You don't need the coat of many colors because now God has allowed somebody else to dress him. In fact, when you look at the way clothing has been used in this text, it's amazing. From the coat that was destroyed by the brothers to the cloak that Potiphar's wife had in her hand, to the way God has now just dressed him, using the best clothier in Egypt, a man named Pharaoh. It's not a gold chain, y'all, like the rappers wear. No, this is a shoulder piece that would have been about 4 to 5 inches thick, that laid over his shoulders and came around his neck in a V shape. This was not some gold chain with a, no. This boy is dressed in a custom way now, because God has sovereignly moved him to a place where he has elevated him simply because he's called him. And you see, I would argue that the king is still calling today. I think the king is still calling people from the dungeons of their own disappointment, the dungeons of their own despair. I think the king is still calling men and women and asking them to come to him. In fact, I would argue that the king didn't just clothe him, but the king actually rewards him by giving him control over the nation of Egypt at this time and giving him charge of the economic system in Egypt at this time. He clothes him, he rewards him, and then later on in this text, what he will do is he will change his name. And he will do all of this based upon the authority of the king. In other words, the authority of the king will clothe him. The authority of the king will reward him. And the authority of the king will change his name. It reminds me of another king who still calls today to say to you and I that you can come up from wherever you are, and that no matter how low you think you've gone, there's a king that can raise you from the guttermost to the uttermost. That's the way Grandma would have said it. That he can lift you up and he can turn you around. There's a king that still calls. And here's the thing I like about this king. This king doesn't just change what you wear. This king doesn't just reward you with his righteousness. This king doesn't just change your name. This king brings you into the royal family, because this king is going to give up his daughter and bring Joseph into the parliament so that our Joseph is a functioning member of royalty. Just like another king I know, who when we were dead in trespasses and in sins, reached out and brought us up, and then he brought us in and made us a part of the family of God. And now, because of who we are and because of who he is, our lives have been changed. Listen, one day you're going to have to stand before the king. I'm not talking about BB. I'm not talking about Michael. I ain't even talking about Don. You're going to have to stand before the King of Kings. And if you try to stand before him clothed in your righteousness, you will be found wanting. What you need is the clothing that the king can produce. His righteousness. Able to stand amidst the call of the King of Kings, clothed in a righteousness not of your own choosing, but of a righteousness that he places upon you. And thereby stand knowing that you possess the righteousness of the Son of the living God. And when that day comes, when God brings you in, he brings you in to send you out. Joseph is clothed, rewarded, brought into royalty. His name is changed and sent out to be in the land of Egypt, what God has called him to be. And the call of the king for every one of us is not to do what we want to do, not to be who we want to be, but to identify with him as king and be his ambassadors in a world that's broken, in a world that needs to be healed, and to represent him rightly while standing straight and clear because of the authority of the king.